You know, if there's one question I get asked more than any other, more even than what is pi to 3,147 decimal places, that question would have to be, how good is Nikon Z6 and its Z180 to 600mm as a combination to bring the distant wildlife into the palm of your hand? Well, today we're going to try and answer that question.
Now, those of you who know me would know that I'm an optimist.
No, you're not.
That I try to see the positive in everything.
No, you don't.
So it breaks my cold, calcified little heart to acknowledge that the Nikon Z6 that I'm recording on here is not perfect. So let's just get into it. The proof is in the pudding, and on the menu today is bird pie. Fortunately, I'm not shooting film, so I'm not actually limited to 4 and 20 exposures to capture 4 and 20 blackbirds. Anyway, the blackbirds in Perth aren't cute, pretty little songbirds. They're voracious carrion scavengers. Do not think of hanging out clothes while singing a song of sixpence. Those bastards will be pecking your flesh without a second glance from those beady, prehistoric little eyes. But I digress. I love wildlife.
No, you don't.
I feel at one with nature.
No, you don't.
So it's always been a goal of mine to capture the majesty of God's gift that is creation, like the expression of rapture on Christopher Frost's face when he tests out the sharpness on a Zeiss Milvus. But nature doesn't always play ball, and neither does the hand wielding the baseball bat that in this instance is a Nikon Z 180 to 600mm f5.6 to 6.3 VR lens. And while I could swat those crows like they were flies with it, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily an ideal wildlife lens. So let's get into the why. We'll start with the lens itself, because honestly, that's the unwitting accessory in this crime against wildlife photography, because it really is a great lens. I could balk at the slow maximum aperture, and truly it is small. With a lens this long, I sometimes wonder how the photons even manage to make it down to the small end and limp to the sensor without petering out down the photographic tunnel. But you've got to remember that we're not in the 1970s anymore. Fast lenses were needed for slow film. Even by the 90s, we had point and shoots that had tiny apertures and managed to get images out of 400 speed film. Again, with the birth of digital, cameras started to have larger aperture lenses to handle long zoom ranges and inefficient sensors. But these days, sensor technology is so good that cameras can pretty much see in the dark. Smaller apertures also allow for more sharpness, and for the most part, the lens is crisp corner to corner. At least this one is. Look, I'm sure there are pros out there that wouldn't go near this, but that's what the Nikon 600mm f4 is made for. I'll never be able to afford one of them, and I'm certainly not a professional. This lens is good enough for me, and let's be real, probably too good for the likes of me. No, I can't blame the lens, and since I'm far too insecure to acknowledge my own frailties, I'm going to blame the camera. Yes, Nikon Z6, it's you. You are the one in choir practice that's groaning while all the Sonys and Canons around you are singing in tune. You are the true culprit. When the Z6 first came out, it did get some flack for being not ready for prime time. Some of that criticism was levelled at the lack of 2-card slots and the limited lens selection, but really the biggest challenge for Nikon was getting the thing to autofocus. Having lost the mirrorless jump to Sony and Micro Four Thirds, Nikon just didn't have the experience in designing on-sensor focus systems. The Z6 II only made incremental improvements despite the addition of dual processors, and it's only now we have the Z9 and the Z8 that can truly say that Nikon has come of age. But I love a challenge, and since I spend most of my time shooting clapped out old film cameras anyway, I'm not above wrangling my camera to extract the best out of it. And the fact is, people have been photographing wild birds since the birth of photography, so if they can do it, why can't I? I mean, yes, it's a bit cumbersome, but I've used older and worse combinations than this, occasionally and even successfully. But look, there's no doubt that there's a definite dark art to focusing with the Nikon Z6, and it's one that I'm only starting to come to grips with. To prove the point, I subjected myself to the humiliation of trying to shoot the Birdlife at my local wetlands in Herdsman, Western Australia.
So the Nikon Z6 is not known for its pinpoint accuracy and its prowess as an autofocus god. Oh, we have ducks. We're on a mission to find wildlife.
Well, that was a struggle. So, here's how Nikon handles focusing. First, you've got your two modes, AFS and AFC. AFS being single focus, which locks on when you press the shutter button, and AFC being continuous focus, meaning it tries to maintain focus while you half press the shutter. And here is my first confession. I don't shoot AFC. The main reason is that when you're continuously focusing, you never really know whether you're locked on or not, and that leads to lots of missed shots for me. AFC is designed specifically for moving subjects like sports and birds, but that's only going to be as good as your camera's ability to keep up. And at least with AFS, you get the comfort in the knowledge that something is in focus, with that satisfying beep and the green confirmation box. So already I'm eliminating half of the focus options in this camera, but I don't really feel like I'm missing out on too much, honestly. Each focus mode has a range of focus area options. Single point is pretty obvious. You get a small area and you make sure that whatever is in that area will be in focus. This is probably my main approach for normal subjects and will definitely bring you your best hit rate. But of course, it takes precision. You can change the shape of the area, making it smaller, larger, or just wider, giving you a broader area to focus on at the expense of that precision. One mode that's unique to continuous autofocus is dynamic area. Think of this as a fuzzy single point focusing. The central box is the main focus point, with dots around it acting as helpers that'll keep you trained on your subject, but only in so much as you can keep it in the broader bounding points of the main focus square. To be fair, the Nikon does a pretty good job of allowing you to move that focus point around using the joystick on the back of the camera, which is much more responsive than any D-pad I've ever used. But all of these modes require you to be able to compose and move the focus point into the correct position. A far easier option is to choose auto area. This is dummy mode, and I'll be honest, I have a tendency to rely on this far too much. You're already pretty much telling the camera to choose its own focus point, and that can work sometimes if the camera knows what it's looking at. The best part of auto area isn't the mode itself, but its ability to lock onto specific types of subjects. In the Nikon Z6, that's people, faces and eyes. Sadly, it doesn't do birds. So we're left with big green boxes rather than the beady eye of your red rumped bush tyrant Smoo. Yes, birds have dumb names, and look, maybe I am a dummy too, but because auto area autofocus works well for many of the subjects I shoot, I keep using it. In these examples, it works fine, simply because there's nothing else for the focus system to get confused by. If there are any distracting elements in the scene, then the camera has a kind of train me to keep half pressing until it finally finds the right focus point. Of course, by that stage, your little bastard has already hopped off and you're left frustratedly flapping your camera around trying to find it again. So, auto area is a bit of a mess, but it does have one trick up its sleeve, and that's when you set it to tracking. Auto area tracking is really the godsend to wildlife photography because rather than you having to move the focus point around, you can simply fit your subject in the center of the scene, engage tracking, and then it will try to follow your subject as you recompose. Perfect for rendering your spangled drongo in full clarity. Engaging it can be a bit tricky, requiring you to remember specific buttons on the back of the camera, but one of the cool things about the 180 to 600mm is that it has this function button on the side of the lens that allows you to engage it and disengage it at the push of that button, without even having to take your eye off the panoply of Birdlife in front of you. If only it worked. Now, to be fair, it does actually work some of the time, and when you get it right, it can yield great results. think the reason why these shots worked was because most of the subjects were fairly easy to isolate in the frame, and so while they did move around a bit, the camera knew what it was looking at. Much less successful was when the scene was busier, largely because the subjects were moving among other objects in the scene. But hey, isn't that what wildlife does? If you can't handle that, then go and shoot some statues. And yes, I am tempted, because honestly, all this autofocus stuff is very confusing. The deeper you delve into the menus, the more convoluted this stuff gets. Like, you can set AFC to only release when it's in focus, which sounds great in theory, though for me, it doesn't increase my hit rate. Instead, I just find myself constantly pressing the shutter with nothing happening. One cool feature is buried in focus tracking, where you can set the blocked shot AF response to quick or delayed. The idea being the focus won't just immediately jump to that leaf your perplexing scrub wren has jumped behind. Honestly, at this stage though, we're just tinkering around the edges, because none of this is going to revolutionize your shooting experience. Ultimately, the Z6 is never going to be an autofocus beast. But there is a twist to this tale, at the very least an embarrassing admission, because as I was preparing this video, I came across this. Yes, since firmware 3, the Nikon Z6 actually has animal eye detect. And you know what? It actually works. Kinda. My notoriously camera-shy dog, Oscar, was patient enough to let me try it out on him, and even using AFC, I was able to actually get some sharp shots in, despite his resembling a flaccati rug more than any animal you'd actually find in the real world. So, maybe I misjudged the Z6, and maybe actually in the real world, animal detection will unleash a whole new world of wildlife to me.
So I'm out again with the Nikon 180 to 600mm lens to hammer that final nail in the coffin of why I'm not a wildlife photographer. Now, I can hear birds I just can't see any. There is a heron in the distance, one of those white ones.
So were the real world results any better? No, not really, though I'm blaming the last crop as much on the timidity of the wildlife the last time I took this combination out as my own skills. The ones that were around offered themselves up pretty willingly enough to the camera. And this gives me pause before I rush into a conclusion about the Nikon Z6 and this 180 to 600mm lens. If I'm to pick the keepers out of this frustrating process, I'm actually pretty surprised by the quality of some of the photos. Maybe I'm being a bit too hard on the camera, or maybe it's just being so overwhelmed by how many of the shots didn't come out that I'm being a bit harsh. One thing's for sure, the Nikon Z 180 to 600mm lens is an amazing optic and really far too good for the likes of me, because I'm not a wildlife photographer and I'm certainly not a bird photographer. I mean, I don't even like birds that much, and while it's always enjoyable to make fun of how stupid some of their names are, these are, after all, prehistoric throwbacks that are more disconcerting than delightful. Think feathers. I mean, how weird are feathers? And those beady eyes. But that doesn't take away the fact that some people like to photograph them. And at the very least, it's beholden on camera companies to pander to their strange fascination. So let's pick half a dozen favorites, and maybe you can tell me if you agree or disagree in the comments below. And while you're at it, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can follow along on the journey as I try to get better at birding, and perhaps more importantly, get better at wrangling the Z6 to actually train its sights on the subject matter in front of it. In the hands of an expert and with a capable camera, the Nikon Z 180 to 600mm lens is a fantastic wildlife lens, and I can't actually complain about my best shots. But with the Z6 and in my hands, this is a bit of an exercise in frustration. But exercise is good for me, and just wait until I upgrade to the Z6 III just around the corner. Then I'll have no excuse, though I'm sure I'll be able to make something up. I promise, regardless, that you're invited to join me as I continue to learn, and who knows, maybe next time I feel like seeking out a little shag or a fluffy-backed tit babbler, I'll be better prepared. Later.